This is Jonah Dempsey, your host of the Human Design Deconditioning Guide. Today I'm going to talk about the spleen. The spleen in human design is one of the centers that has become a major center from being a minor center for the seven-centered being. You know, if you're familiar with chakras and you study the seven-centered being, you'll know that the spleen was not one of the major seven centers. It was a minor chakra. But it is a major chakra for human design. And this is just as a side note, one of the interesting things is that when you're coming from a seven-centered framework, you know, there's this idea, this kind of, well, which chakra is which center in human design? It doesn't really work that way. The seven chakras, the seven primary chakras, were valid for 90,000 years. You know, they were valid since the shift from Neanderthal. I mean, we evolved into the seven-centered from the five-centered being over the course of tens of thousands of years, completing the transition around maybe 50,000 years ago, but absolutely starting with the dropping of the larynx 90,000 years ago. So the seven-centered paradigm was valid, but we are no longer in a seven-centered paradigm, and it's kind of incredible to realize just how recently the nine-centered paradigm has begun. It was actually 1781 with the discovery of the planet Uranus. So in any case, we still have all this detritus, this leftover from being seven-centered, and so we're kind of, you know, it's so simple to go, well, okay, which chakra is this, which chakra is that? It doesn't really work that way. We have a new matrix now, a new configuration, you could say. Okay, so the spleen, you'll notice it on the left of the body graph. It's that triangle on the left, just like there's a triangle on the right, which is the solar plexus. The spleen is a very, very old center. It is an ancient center. It's around in three-centered beings, and in five-centered beings, and in seven-centered beings. You know, it was still there. I mean, that's the thing. It's like the seven-centered being is actually highly splenic. When we look at the seven chakras, we don't see the spleen as one of the major chakras, but it's still present as a theme. So the theme is survival, and it's strategy, and it's logic, and it's basically this fundamental center of survival through intelligence. And as such, it is also a center of fear. So, you know, it has to be, because fear and intelligence always go hand in hand. Intelligence is rooted in fear. The spleen is associated with the first and second lines, and the first and second colors, and the first and second tones. So for those of you who study line, color, and tone, you'll know that there are 6 lines, which correspond through continuity with the 6 colors, which also correspond to the 6 tones. And this six-fold division, just like you find in the Chinese hexagram, this division is a key. It's a repeating fractal that is essentially a key to the Maya. And in that key, the first and second divisions, the first and second parts, correspond to the spleen. The third and fourth correspond to the ajna, the third eye, and the fifth and sixth correspond to the solar plexus. And they tell an evolutionary story. And this evolutionary story is out of the survival-based, strategic, fearful spleen to the ajna, which the left half is still in left variable survival strategy mode, and then transforms to the right half of the ajna, so it's split, and the right half, the right variable, is all about resource-based, non-competitive, non-strategic, flow. And then finally we get to the solar plexus, which is fully right variable and kind of represents the future of not being concerned with survival and so on. So the spleen is as far left as you can go. If you're familiar with variable and you know about left variable and right variable, the spleen is like extremely left in theme, right? So that's why I'm saying that even though the seven-centered being didn't have a spleen chakra, it was still extremely splenic. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of context for what the spleen is about. The spleen is the center of intelligence. The spleen is also on the logical side. The solar plexus is on the abstract side. Now, if you don't know the difference in logic and abstract, I've done a video on circuitry. It's really fascinating. The logical process has to do with repetition and with perfecting through improvement. And it's basically about experimenting and coming up with formulas, observing patterns, tweaking these formulas, and so on. The abstract process is purely experiential. Nothing can be repeated. It has no interest in repetition. It has no interest in perfecting. It's about experiences, which have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's it. So, the solar plexus side is about purely singular experiences. There's no pattern to them, because every experience is unique. And incidentally, relationship bonding is all on the solar plexus side, like sexual bonding. So when you're in a romantic relationship with someone, the worst thing you can try to do is to try to improve it, or to try to perfect it. But the splenic side, just as a side note, is about caring, what you care about. And the spleen contains all the individual and the tribal and the collective caring. Individual caring, where you care about personal empowerment and you care to, basically, you want people to care when you need them, and you don't want them to care too much about you because it disempowers you. You don't want them to try to care about you when you don't need them, because that's disempowering. And the tribal caring, which is caring that the person has enough food, that they have sustenance, that they have things they need, that they're not in pain, and so on. All the way to caring at the collective level, which is, caring about everything, really, everything you can possibly care about. Caring about the environment, caring if someone made a typo, if they're using the word incorrectly, caring about all sorts of stuff. Okay, so the spleen is different from the solar plexus insofar as the spleen is about improving. It's a logical system. The spleen also has integration circuitry, and it has individual and it has tribal. So I don't mean to say that it's purely logical. There are many parts of the spleen, but logic is one of them. And you can see that it has to do with our survival, because each of these are core elements of survival. So integration circuitry, the spleen has gate 54, which connects to our integration circuitry. That is literally just about intelligence. The foundation of intelligence for survival. But then you can see that there's also tribal aspects, like gate 44 coming out of the spleen, right? Or the tribal channel connecting 54 in the root to the spleen, where basically that's all about everyday, mundane, interaction. Just interacting with other people in order to have a community, basically. And gate 44 connects to 26 in the ego, which goes from the cold-blooded spleen to the hot-blooded side with the heart. See, the spleen can be downright reptilian, something we share with fish and birds and reptiles. It's the cold-blooded part of ourselves. So you can see there's a tribal aspect to the spleen also, which speaks to the necessity of the tribe in survival. You can't survive on your own. And then there's the collective aspect, but the collective aspect is logical. So in order to survive, you need to be able to perceive patterns. You need to be able to predict outcomes. See, logic is always making predictions. The abstract has no purpose for predictions. The abstract process over on the solar plexus side is looking back to the past and abstracting things from the past, extracting from them. It's very different from the logical process, which is looking at patterns and making predictions for the future. Okay, so what is it if you have defined spleen? Well, first of all, if you have defined spleen, holistic medicine will not work on you. Homeopathy will not work on you. If you have defined spleen, you're going to be able to trust when you pick up something to the back of your neck, when you pick up, goosebumps, muscle twitches, or a whisper, an internal whisper that says, turn left, duck, go over there. You'll notice this and you can trust this. It is your intuition speaking to you. And in fact, if you don't have a defined sacral or defined solar plexus, this is your authority. It's third in the authority hierarchy. The solar plexus overrides all other authorities. But then if you don't have solar plexus defined and you do have sacral, then that is your authority. But if you don't have sacral defined and you do have spleen, that is your authority. And so the spleen can be very powerful. It can be a way of guiding, but it only ever tells you once, and it's only in the moment. It's purely spontaneous. If you have defined spleen, you can be spontaneous. If you have undefined spleen, being spontaneous can get you killed. Don't be spontaneous if you have undefined spleen. Only do things that you've, considered or prepared for in some way. I won't say planned because it's not appropriate for everyone to plan. If you have innocence motivation, for instance, it's not appropriate for you to plan. But you could still be prepared in some sense. Okay, so defined spleen, they consistently feel good. They're going to feel smothered by the not self of the undefined spleen. Because the undefined spleen is always holding on, doesn't want to let go. If you have undefined spleen, realize that you're not going to avoid frustration by holding on. You're not going to avoid bitterness or anger or disappointment by holding on. You just got to let go. Let go and don't hold on so tightly to the other people, particularly in your life. It can be things also, it can be habits, it can be all sorts of stuff. But holding on to other people is a big one. Okay, so with defined spleen, you're not going to notice your health changing as much. In fact, what you're going to notice is that when you get sick, you get really sick out of the blue. It's like a huge spike, and then you go back to being okay. It gets really, really bad. It's like 0 to 60 super quick, and then back to normal. But you're normally fine, usually fine. Now, it's funny because undefined spleen people feel sickly a lot, but they actually tend to have better overall health because they are so sensitive. They're so sensitive to every little thing that they notice when they're getting sick and they adjust. So good advice for the defined spleen is don't be so hard on your body. Good advice for the undefined spleen is don't be a hypochondriac. Don't worry so much. And don't hold on so tightly to the people that make you feel good. Here's a little homework for the undefined spleen. Next time you're hanging out with people, chances are you'll have defined spleen with them, either through electromagnetic or because their spleen is defined. You can confirm this by looking at their body graph and seeing if they have defined spleen, or seeing if they have the harmonic gate to one of your gates that forms a channel that defines the spleen. Notice that when you spend time with them, you feel safe, you feel good. If you had a cold, you probably stopped noticing you had a cold, and so on. Then notice when they leave how alone you feel, how just by yourself, and just kind of how that feel good has been taken away from you, how that dopamine hit, or whatever it is, has been taken away. Then ask yourself, am I holding on to things that aren't good for me? Am I making decisions because of that feel good? Making decisions that bring me that feel good? Because realize that that feel good is not the most important thing for you. The most important thing is your strategy and authority. If you have defined spleen, be easier on your body. Take care of yourself. If you have undefined spleen, don't hold on to things and look at the holistic thing. If you have undefined spleen, try homeopathy. It works. All right, this is your host of the Human Design Deconditioning Guide, Jonah Dempsey. Thank you for watching. Take care.